The courtroom hummed with a charged tension as the teenage girl stood at the defense table, her eyes locked on Judge Torres, whose skeptical gaze bore down on her. Grace Harper, just 16 years old, clutched a stack of well-worn papers in her trembling hands, her slight frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, her tone a mix of disbelief and condescension. "You seriously think you can defend yourself in this court against trained attorneys? You're a child, Miss Harper. This is no place for amateur theatrics. You're in way over your head." Judge Torres declared, her voice sharp and final. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, a mix of ridicule and unease. A few smirks flashed among the spectators, and even the prosecutor, William Crane, chuckled under his breath. Grace's cheeks burned, but she held her ground, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling for a moment, before finding strength. "With all due respect, Statute 28 U.S.C. Section 1654 explicitly states that individuals have the right to represent themselves in court. I may not be a trained attorney, but I have the same right to justice as anyone else, and I intend to fight for it." A hush fell over the courtroom. The murmur stopped. Even the judge seemed caught off guard by the calm conviction in Grace's voice. But just a month ago, Grace never imagined she'd find herself in a courtroom, let alone defending her own life. She was just an ordinary girl and high school student, juggling homework and babysitting her brother, until a single moment turned her world upside down. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And, as always, if you stand for truth and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadow across the playground as Grace Harper sat on a wooden bench, her eyes darting between her phone and her 10-year-old brother Liam. He was climbing up the monkey bars with the boundless energy that only kids seem to have after a long school day. Grace, 16 years old, but with a maturity far beyond her years, tucked her hands into the sleeves of her oversized sweatshirt to fight off the chill of the crisp autumn air. "Just 10 minutes, Liam," she called out. "We still need to get home before dinner." "Okay, Grace," he shouted back, his voice full of excitement. His blonde hair stuck out from under his red baseball cap as he hung upside down. Grinning widely, Grace smiled faintly and returned her attention to her phone. Homework deadlines loomed, but Liam's joy was infectious. She let herself relax for a moment, relishing the rare slice of normalcy. It had been a tough year, full of upheavals she wasn't ready to revisit, but moments like this, just her and Liam, helped her push through. The peace didn't last. A group of older teenagers sauntered onto the playground, their loud laughter and crude jokes cutting through the calm. Grace glanced up, her stomach tightening as she recognized Ryan Matthews leading the group known for stirring up trouble. Ryan was the kind of kid parents warned their children about. Grace had seen him around school, loud, brash, and always looking for an audience. Liam, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere, continued playing until Ryan's group spotted him. They exchanged knowing smirks before striding toward the monkey bars. "Hey kid," Ryan called out, his tone mocking. "What are you doing up there? Aren't you a little small for this stuff?" Liam froze mid-climb, glancing at Grace for reassurance. She immediately stood, her protective instincts kicking in. Before she could intervene, Ryan reached up and snatched Liam's red baseball cap. "Give it back," Liam protested. Scrambling down from the monkey bars, he tried to grab the hat, but Ryan held it out of reach, laughing. "What's the magic word? Short stack," Ryan teased, dangling the cap just above Liam's fingers. Grace was already moving toward them, her pulse quickening. "Hey," she shouted, her voice firm. "Leave him alone." Ryan turned, his smirk widening as he took her in. Well, if it isn't big sister, what are you going to do about it?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Give the hat back now." Ryan ignored her, tossing the cap to one of his friends. The group laughed as Liam chased after it, only for another boy to snatch it away. Grace clenched her fists, her voice rising. "I said stop, you're being jerks. And he's just a kid." Ryan stepped closer to her, his mocking grin hardening into something meaner. "And what if we don't? What are you going to do, boss us around?" Grace held her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She was scared, but she wasn't going to let them bully Liam. "Just give it back now," Ryan scoffed, and gave her a light shove, as though testing her. Karen's eyes darted to the row of metal chairs along the wall, but she couldn't sit still pacing the lobby. She wrung her hands, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She felt powerless, and it terrified her. Back in the interrogation room, the door opened again, and Karen was finally allowed to enter. Her heart broke at the sight of Grace sitting so small and scared at the table. She rushed to her daughter's side, enveloping her in a protective hug. "Mom," Grace whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't do it. I swear." Karen pulled back to look at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know, sweetheart, I believe you, but we need to figure out how to get you out of here." Before Karen could say more, the officer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper, I understand this is difficult, but the evidence is against her. Ryan Matthews is in the hospital, and we have multiple witnesses saying Grace pushed him." Karen turned to the officer, her voice rising in desperation. "She's a child. She was protecting her brother. For God's sake, you can't treat her like some hardened criminal." The officer's expression remained neutral, almost bored. "The case is moving forward. Unless you can afford a private attorney, shall be assigned a public defender." Karen's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. "We can't afford a lawyer," she admitted quietly, her voice laced with shame. Later, Grace sat across from the public defender, a man in his late 30s who looked as tired as she felt. He shuffled through a stack of papers, barely glancing up at her. "All right," he began, his tone brisk. "Let's cut to the chase. The evidence isn't in your favor. There are witnesses who say you pushed him, and Ryan Matthews is in critical condition. This isn't the kind of case where you can just explain things away." Grace frowned. "But it was self-defense. He pushed me first." The defender sighed, rubbing his temples. "Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. Ryan's injuries are severe, and the court's going to focus on that, not who pushed who first." "So what are you saying?" Grace asked, her voice tense. "I'm saying you should take a plea deal," he replied. "It's your best option. Plead guilty to a lesser charge, and you might avoid a long sentence. Go to trial, and you could be looking at a lot worse." Karen, sitting beside Grace, leaned forward. "But she's innocent. Isn't it your job to defend her?" The defender gave her a weary look. "Ma'am, I have 100 other cases just like this. I'm telling you the reality of the situation. A trial is risky." Grace's fists clenched under the table. "I'm not pleading guilty," she said firmly. "I didn't do anything wrong." The defender shook his head. "You don't understand how the system works, kid. The truth doesn't always matter." Karen's eyes filled with tears as she turned to her daughter. "Grace, maybe we should think about it." "I don't want to see you." "No, Mom," Grace interrupted, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I'm not taking the deal. I'm going to fight this." Karen looked at her in shock. "Grace, you don't have the experience for this. You need someone to help you." Grace straightened her spine, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "If no one else will help me, I'll do it myself." The room fell silent as Karen and the public defender stared at her, both stunned. Grace had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let fear or pressure dictate her actions. She was going to fight for the truth, no matter what it took. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Grace sat at a cramped table in the local library, her fingers furiously flipping through a thick textbook on criminal law. Her notebook was a mess of scribbled notes, underlined phrases, and hastily drawn arrows connecting various legal terms. She was trying to make sense of the daunting weight of her task loomed over her, but Grace refused to let it overwhelm her. She had made her choice. If no one else would fight for her, she'd do it herself. Stacks of books surrounded her, each one filled with dense legal jargon that made her head spin. She paused, resting her forehead against her hands. "Reasonable doubt," she murmured aloud, circling the term in her notebook. "Self-defense, burden of proof. How am I supposed to turn this into something that can actually save me?" The soft shuffle of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Monroe, the librarian, approached, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun and her warm eyes filled with curiosity. "You've been in here every day this week," she said, her voice gentle. "What are you working on?" Dear Grace hesitated, unsure if she could trust anyone, but something about Mrs. Monroe's kind demeanor put her at ease. "I'm preparing for it." "Trial," Grace admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm defending myself." Mrs. Monroe raised her eyebrows but didn't laugh or dismiss her. Instead, she pulled out the chair across from Grace and sat down. That's quite an undertaking, she said, folding her hands on the table. But it's not impossible. I was a pargirl for 30 years before I retired. Maybe I can help. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. You would do that? Why? Mrs. Monroe smiled. Because everyone deserves a fair chance, especially someone who's brave enough to fight for themselves. With Mrs. Monroe's guidance, Grace's approach began to take shape. The librarian taught her how to navigate legal databases, pointing out key cases that could support her argument. Together, they outlined Grace's defense, breaking down the elements of self-defense and how to present her side of the story. Remember, Mrs. Monroe said one afternoon, sliding a print out across the table, the law is about logic and evidence. If you can point out inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, you can create doubt. And doubt can mean the difference between conviction and acquittal. Grace nodded, jotting down notes. But what about the witnesses? They're all lying to make it look like I attacked Ryan for no reason. Mrs. Monroe's expression grew thoughtful. Then your job is to show the court why their stories don't add up. Focus on the details. They'll trip themselves up if you ask the right questions. Outside the library, Grace's life was a different story. At school, the hallways felt narrower, the whispers louder. She passed a group of classmates clustered around a phone, their laughter stinging like needles. Here comes the psycho, one of them muttered loud enough for her to hear. Grace gritted her teeth and kept walking, her fists clenched at her sides. Later, she discovered cruel memes circulating on social media. Her school photo photoshopped behind prison bars, captions accusing her of being a violent maniac. Even some of her teachers seemed to look at her differently, their words laced with thinly veiled judgment. In the cafeteria, she sat alone, her tray untouched, as she stared at her notebook. Every taunt, every glare only fueled her resolve. They don't know the truth, she whispered to herself, but I'll make sure they hear it. One evening, Grace's determination took a hit. Mrs. Monroe had mentioned the possibility of CCTV footage from the park, and Grace had eagerly requested it, convinced it would clear her name. But when the police informed her that the footage was unavailable due to a technical glitch, her frustration boiled over. A glitch, she repeated, her voice rising. You're telling me that the one thing that could prove I didn't attack him just conveniently doesn't exist? The officer on the other end of the line sighed. I understand it's frustrating, but there's nothing we can do. The camera weren't recording that day. Grace slammed the phone down, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. It felt like the system was stacked against her at every turn. Do you think it was really a glitch, or was someone intentionally destroying evidence? Share your thoughts below and give the video a like if you're rooting for Grace to come out of this trial on top. That night, Grace spread out every piece of evidence she had on the kitchen table. Liam sat nearby, coloring quietly, while Karen hovered nervously. Sweetheart, you've been at this for hours, Karen said, placing a hand on her shoulder. You need to take a break. I can't, Mom, Grace replied, not looking up. I have to find something. If the CCTV footage is gone, I need another way to prove what happened. Karen sighed, her worry etched into her face. I'm proud of you, Grace, but I hate seeing you carry this all on your own. Grace paused, her gaze softening. I don't have a choice, Mom. If I don't do this, who will? As Grace reviewed the witness statements, a pattern began to emerge. Ryan's friends, who had been so quick to accuse her, contradicted each other in subtle ways. One claimed Grace shoved Ryan hard enough to send him flying, while another said she barely touched him before he tripped. Grace highlighted these discrepancies, her confidence growing with each inconsistency she uncovered. The next day at the library, she showed Mrs. Au her findings. The librarian smiled, nodding in approval. You're starting to think like a lawyer, she said. Keep going. Build your case piece by piece. Grace smiled back, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she had a fighting chance, but she knew the road ahead would only get tougher. The courtroom loomed on the horizon, and Grace was determined to be ready. The sharp clang of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, silencing the low hum of whispers. The air was thick with tension. The gallery filled to capacity with curious spectators, reporters, and a few familiar faces from Grace's school. Grace Harper sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her meticulously organized notes lay before her, but the polished words she had rehearsed over and over felt distant in her mind. Across the room, The imposing figure of District Attorney William Crane took his place at the prosecution table. His tailored suit and confident demeanor exuded authority. He was a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for securing convictions, and the gleam in his eyes as he glanced toward Grace hinted that he considered this case already won. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Crane began, his voice smooth and commanding. Today, we address a grave matter, a young life nearly lost due to an act of reckless violence. His words hung heavy in the air as he gestured toward the gallery where Ryan's parents sat, their faces etched with worry. Ryan Matthews remains in critical condition, fighting for his life because of the actions of Grace Harper. He paced slowly, his tone growing sharper. The evidence will show that this was not an act of self-defense or a simple misunderstanding. This was an unprovoked attack by a volatile teenager who let her emotions get the better of her. Ryan Matthews deserves justice, and this community deserves accountability. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. The gallery murmured in agreement, their whispers like needles pricking her resolve. She glanced toward the jury, trying to read their expressions. Most were blank, but a few who nodded subtly as Crane finished his opening statement with a flourish emphasizing the seriousness of the charges against her. Judge Evelyn Torres turned her attention to Grace, her neutral expression offering no clues to her thoughts. Miss Harper, you may proceed with your opening statement. Grace rose slowly, her legs feeling like lead. Her heart pounded, but she took a steadying breath and forced herself to meet the eyes of the jury. Good morning, she began, her voice trembling slightly before it steadied. My name is Grace Harper, and I'm here to tell you the truth about what happened that day. She clasped her hands in front of her words sincere and heartfelt. I never meant to hurt Ryan Matthews. I was only trying to protect my little brother Liam from being bullied. What happened was a terrible accident, but it wasn't the result of anger or violence. It was the result of me being scared for my brother's safety. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a 16-year-old trying to tell my side of the story. All I ask is that you listen with an open mind and consider the facts. As she returned to her seat, a flicker of doubt crossed the face of one juror in the front row. Grace clung to that small sign of hope, though the judge's impassive expression did little to reassure her. The prosecution wasted no time calling their first witness, Justin, one of Ryan's friends who had been at the park that day. Justin took the stand with an air of confidence, his gaze darting briefly toward Grace before settling on Crane. Justin Crane began, his tone warm and inviting. Can you tell the court what you saw on the day of the incident? Justin nodded. Yeah, Grace just walked up to Ryan and started yelling at him. She was really aggressive, saying things like, stay away from my brother, and then she shoved him. Ryan didn't even do anything. He was just standing there. Crane nodded sympathetically. And what happened after that? Ryan stumbled back and fell over the bench. He hit his head on the concrete. Justin said, his voice faltering slightly as he described the scene. It was bad. There was blood everywhere. Grace's stomach churned as the gallery erupted into murmurs. She clenched her fists under the table, determined not to let her frustration show. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Justin, she began, meeting his gaze directly. You said Ryan didn't do anything, but isn't it true that he took my brother's baseball cap and refused to give it back? Justin shifted in his seat. I don't remember that. Grace picked up a copy of the police report and held it up. According to your statement to the police, you said Ryan took the cap as a joke. So which is it? Did he take it or didn't he? Crane shot to his feet. Objection. Relevance. Judge Torres sighed, glancing at Grace. Miss Harper, unless you can show how this line of questioning pertains to the charge of assault, move on. Grace hesitated, her mind racing for a response. Your Honor, this goes to the credibility of the witness. If he's inconsistent about this, how can we trust his version of events? The judge considered this for a moment before nodding. I'll allow it. Proceed. Justin's face reigned as Grace pressed further, but Crane quickly redirected the narrative with another objection. This time sustained. Grace returned to her seat, feeling a mix of triumph and frustration. The next witness, another friend of Ryan's, added even more dramatic embellishments to the story, claiming, Grace screamed like a maniac and showed Ryan with such force that he flew back. Like a rag doll, Grace bit her tongue to keep from rolling her eyes, knowing that any outburst would hurt her case. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she focused on the details, pointing out contradictions in their timelines and questioning their descriptions of her behavior. You said I screamed at Ryan, she said to the witness, but another witness said I didn't raise my voice, which is it? The witness faltered, stammering, I guess it wasn't really screaming, but it was loud. Grace pressed on, but Crane's objections kept cutting her off, framing her questions as irrelevant or badgering. Each time the judge sustained an objection, Grace felt the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her, threatening to crush her resolve. By the end of the day, Grace sat at the defense table, her energy drained. As the judge adjourned for the day, Mrs. Monroe caught her eye from the gallery and gave her a reassuring nod outside the courthouse. Grace slumped onto a bench, her head in her hands. Mrs. Monroe approached, her voice calm and steady. You're doing better than you think, Grace. You're planting seeds of doubt. That's all you need right now. Grace looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. It doesn't feel like enough. Mrs. Monroe placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Keep going. The truth has a way of shining through even when it feels impossible. Grace nodded, steeling herself for the battles ahead. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the courtroom as Grace sat at the defense table, flipping through her notes. The weight of the previous day's proceedings still lingered, but her determination had sharpened. Today was critical. She needed to expose the cracks in the prosecution Ryan's case if she had any hope of turning the tide. Judge Torres entered with her usual stern demeanor, calling the court to order. Grace took a deep breath, steeling herself as she rose from her chair. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside her. The defense would like to call our first witness, Jamie Taylor. Jamie, that middle-aged jogger with a no-nonsense demeanor, took the stand dressed in a simple tracksuit. They sat upright, giving Grace a small nod of encouragement. Grace approached with measured steps, meeting Jim's eyes. Jimmy, can you tell the court where you were on the day of the incident? Grace asked. Jimmy cleared their throat. I was jogging through the park like I do most afternoons. I was on the path near the playground when I heard yelling. That's when I saw a group of kids arguing. And what did you see after that? Grace pressed. Jimmy hesitated, their expression thoughtful. The scene was chaotic, a lot of shouting, people moving around. I saw a boy trip and fall, but I couldn't tell who pushed him or if anyone did. It all happened so fast. Grace nodded, her voice calm. So to clarify, you didn't see me shove Ryan Matthews? No, I didn't, Jamie replied firmly. The gallery buzzed with whispers and Grace caught a flicker of doubt on a few jurors' faces. It was a small win, but Crane was quick to respond. Mr. Taylor, Crane said as he rose for cross-examination, his tone smooth and practiced. You mentioned the scene was chaotic. Would you agree that chaos can make it difficult to see everything clearly? Yes, Jimmy admitted, and in that chaos it's possible you missed critical moments, like, for example, the defendant pushing Ryan Matthews. Crane's voice carried an undercurrent of accusation. Jamie shifted in their seat. I suppose it's possible, but that's all. Thank you, Crane interjected, cutting them off before they could elaborate. Grace clenched her fists, but forced herself to stay composed. The prosecution called their next witness, Megan Daniels, Ryan's girlfriend. Megan entered the courtroom with an air of confidence, her polished appearance and composed demeanor giving the impression of credibility. She cast a disdainful glance at Grace as she took the stand. Crane began his questioning with a warm smile. Megan, how long have you known Ryan Matthews? We've been dating for about a year, Megan replied, her voice steady. And in that time, did you ever witness any interactions between Ryan and the defendant? Grace Harper. Megan nodded. Yes, Grace has a reputation for being confrontational. She and Ryan had arguments before, and she even threatened him once in the school cafeteria. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Grace's jaw tightened. She had never exchanged more than a few words with Megan, let alone Ryan. Crane continued, can you tell the court about one of those arguments? Megan leaned forward, her tone almost theatrical. It was about a month ago, Grace accused Ryan of bullying her brother, and she got right in his face. She told him he'd regret it if he didn't. Back off. The prosecution's case gained momentum as Crane played up Megan's testimony, painting Grace as a volatile figure. Grace's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she rose with quiet determination. Megan, Grace began, her voice level. You testified that I threatened Ryan in the cafeteria. Were you there when this supposed argument happened? Well, no, Megan admitted reluctantly, but Ryan told me about it. And who else was there to witness this argument? Grace asked, tilting her head slightly. Megan hesitated. I don't know. Some of Ryan's friends, I guess. So your testimony is based entirely on what Ryan and his friends told you? Grace's tone was calm but firm. Megan bristled. I trust Ryan. He wouldn't lie about something like that. Grace paced slowly. Megan, do you recall what date this alleged argument happened? It was sometime in September, Megan said, vaguely glancing toward Crane as if seeking reassurance. Grace paused, letting the silence hang in the room. September. That's interesting because Ryan's friends testified yesterday that the bullying incident at the park was the first time I confronted him. How do you explain that? Megan's face rent, her composure slipping. I don't know. Maybe they forgot. Grace pressed on. Or maybe it never happened. Maybe you're repeating stories you heard without verifying the truth. Objection. Crane's voice cut through the tension, badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Torrey said, though her gaze lingered on Megan, her skepticism evident. Grace returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had poked holes in Megan's testimony, but the damage had been done. The gallery still buzzed with speculation, and the jury's expressions were a mix of doubt and curiosity. The day's proceedings took a darker turn as Crane introduced Ryan's medical records. A specialist took the stand, describing in clinical detail the extent of Ryan's injuries, his fractured skull, the swelling in his brain, and the emergency surgery he required. The sterile language couldn't mask the gravity of the situation, and Grace felt the jury's sympathy shift toward Ryan. This wasn't an accident, Crane declared during his closing remarks for the day. The severity of Ryan's injuries is consistent with a deliberate act of aggression. Grace Harper didn't just shove Ryan, she put his life in danger. The weight of Crane's words hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Grace sat frozen, her mind racing. When the session adjourned, Mrs. Monroe met her outside the courthouse, her expression serious. You did well with Megan, Mrs. Monroe said, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. But Crane is building a strong emotional case. You need something concrete to counter it. I know, Grace whispered, her voice heavy with frustration, but every time I think I'm making progress, he tears it apart. Then you dig deeper, Mrs. Monroe said firmly. There's always something, you just have to find it. As Grace walked home that evening, her thoughts swirled. Megan's shaky testimony and the jogger's account weren't enough to clear her name. She needed a game-changing piece of evidence, something undeniable. She clenched her fists, her determination hardening. She wouldn't stop until she found it. The courtroom felt heavier with each passing day. Grace sat at her desk in her small bedroom, a sea of documents and notes scattered before her. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated her tired face as she rubbed her temples. Sleep had become an afterthought, replaced by the relentless drive to unearth something, anything that could shift the trial in her favor. The sound of her brother Liam's soft snores from the next room was a small comfort. It reminded her of why she couldn't give up. She shuffled through court documents, prosecution notes, and public records until a single file caught her attention. Ryan Matthews' medical history. The document detailed prior injuries he had sustained. Grace's eyes narrowed as she spotted a familiar pattern. The injuries listed bore an uncanny resemblance to the ones he suffered in the park. Intrigued, she dug deeper, combing through more records. What she found made her stomach churn. Ryan had been involved in multiple violent altercations at school, many of which escalated due to his own actions. One file stood out, an incident in which Ryan provoked a classmate during gym class, only to turn the blame around and claim he had been attacked. The parallels to her case were too striking to ignore. Grace couldn't contain her thoughts any longer. She grabbed her phone and called Mrs. Monroe, who answered on the second ring. Grace, it's late, the librarian said, her voice tinged with concern. "I found something," Grace blurted out. "Ryan has a history of injuries and his school records show he's been in fights before. This could prove he and his friends aren't innocent victims." There was a pause before Mrs. Monroe replied, "That's significant, Grace, but you need to be careful. Evidence like that can be seen as prejudicial unless you can directly tie it to your case." Grace scribbled notes on the margin of her notebook. "How do I do that?" "Focus on relevance," Mrs. Monroe advised. "Show how this pattern connects to the incident. Don't just suggest he's a troublemaker. Prove it relates to his credibility." And the narrative Crane is building. The next morning, Grace entered the courtroom with her head held high, gripping the files she had spent the night preparing. The gallery was packed, the buzz of spectators growing louder as her case gained media attention outside. Protesters had gathered, their voices rising in a cacophony of conflicting opinions. Some held signs proclaiming justice for Grace, while others read no excuses for violence. Karen placed a protective arm around Grace as they walked past reporters clamoring for a statement. "Keep your head up, sweetheart," Karen whispered. "You're doing amazing." Inside, the tension was palpable. Judge Torres banged her gavel, calling the court to order. Grace stood, her hands trembling slightly as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the pressure. "The defense would like to submit a motion to introduce evidence regarding Ryan Matthews' prior conduct, specifically incidents that demonstrate a pattern of aggressive behavior." Crane's chair scraped loudly as he rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a blatant attempt to smear the victim's character. It's irrelevant to the case at hand." Grace turned to the judge, holding up the files. "Your Honor, this evidence directly challenges the credibility of the prosecution's narrative. It shows that Ryan has a history of instigating fights and then claiming to be the victim. That pattern is crucial in understanding what happened during the incident at the park." The judge frowned, leaning back in her chair. "Miss Harper, do you have concrete evidence linking these incidents to your case?" Grace nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Ryan's friends who testified against me were also involved in several of these altercations. This isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a larger pattern." Judge Torres tapped her pen against the desk, considering. Finally, she nodded. "I'll allow the evidence, but only if you can directly connect it to the events in question." The gallery erupted in murmurs as Grace approached the witness stand. Using Ryan's school records, she highlighted several instances where he had been involved in fights. One stood out: a scuffle in which Ryan falsely accused another student of hitting him first, a claim later disproven by witnesses. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice clear and firm, "this record demonstrates a consistent pattern of behavior. Ryan has a history of provoking conflicts and then deflecting blame onto others. This directly undermines the credibility of his friends' testimonies and raises serious doubts about the prosecution's case." Crane sprang to his feet. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than speculation. The defendant is grasping at straws." Grace didn't flinch. "I'm presenting documented evidence, not speculation. If the prosecution wants to contest it, they're welcome to cross-examine me." Judge Torres raised a hand, silencing Crane. "Sit down, Mr. Crane." Miss Harper perceived the rest of the day was a grueling back and forth. Crane did everything in his power to discredit Grace's argument, emphasizing her lack of formal legal training and accusing her of attempting to distract from the severity of Ryan's injuries. But Grace held her ground, citing legal precedents Mrs. Monroe had helped her find outside the courthouse. The media frenzy reached new heights. Protesters clashed, their chants filling the air as Karen shielded Grace from the chaos. Reporters shoved microphones in their faces, shouting questions. "Miss Harper, do you think introducing Ryan's past is fair to the victim?" "Grace, are you trying to deflect blame?" Karen pulled Grace through the crowd, her expression fierce. "No comment," she snapped, holding Grace close as they climbed into a cab. That evening, Grace sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Liam peeked around the corner, holding a crayon drawing of Grace standing in a courtroom with a superhero. "Kate, this is for you," he said, chilly, sliding the paper across the table. Grace smiled, her eyes misting. "Thanks, buddy." Karen joined them, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You're doing everything you can, Grace. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Grace nodded, but her mind was already racing. The trial wasn't over, and the next few days would determine everything. She couldn't afford to let up now, not when the truth was so close. The tension in the Harper household was palpable as Grace sat across from Karen at the kitchen table. Liam was in the living room trying to distract himself with cartoons, but Grace could hear the low hum of the television. And his restless shuffling. Karen's voice broke the silence. Grace, I don't like this. Liam's just a child asking him to testify. It's too much for him. Grace leaned forward, her eyes earnest. Mom, I don't want him to do this either, but he's the only person who saw everything. His voice could change everything. Karen's lips tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. But what if Crane twists his words? What if they make him look like he doesn't know what he's talking about? Mom, Grace said softly, Liam is braver than any of us give him credit for. If we explain everything to him, I think he can handle it. The conversation ended with Karen reluctantly agreeing. Later that evening, Grace sat with Liam on the couch, speaking to him in a calm, measured tone. She explained what it would mean to testify, making sure he understood it was his choice. I want to help you, Grace. Liam said, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. I don't want them to think you're bad. You're not. Her throat tightened, but she managed a smile. Okay, buddy, let's do this together. The next day in court, the gallery was unusually full. The media frenzy surrounding the trial had reached new heights, and protesters from both sides packed the courthouse steps. Grace watched as Karen nervously guided Liam into the courtroom. His small frame seemed even smaller under the weight of so many watchful eyes, but his chin was set with determination. Call your next witness, Judge Torres instructed, her tone neutral but firm. Grace rose, her heart pounding. The defense calls Liam Harper to the stand. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as Liam made his way to the witness box. The clerk swore him in, and Grace approached, giving him an encouraging nod. Liam, she began, keeping her tone gentle, can you tell the court what happened at the park that day? Liam took a deep breath, his eyes flickering nervously to the crowd before returning to Grace. I was playing on the swings and these older boys came over. They started making fun of me and calling me names. One of them took my hat. Do you recognize the boy who took your hat? Grace asked. Liam nodded. It was Ryan. Grace paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. And then what happened? They told me I should leave because I was too small to be there. Liam said, his voice trembling slightly. I got scared, so I yelled for Grace. She came over and told them to stop. What did Ryan do when Grace asked him to stop? Grace asked, her voice steady. He pushed her. Liam said, his voice rising with indignation. She only pushed him back because he wouldn't leave me alone. Crane rose for his cross-examination, his expression unreadable. He approached Liam with deliberate slowness, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. Liam, he said, you're very young, aren't you? I'm 10, Liam replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And do you remember everything that happened that day, Liam, or is it possible that some of it is a little blurry? Crane asked, leaning in slightly. Liam fidgeted, glancing at Grace before answering. I remember, it happened right in front of me.